So ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Margie Warrell.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'd like you just to look at the person each side of you, give them a high five and say, "You're awesome." The question is, you are all awesome. And the question is, what is it that stops us from being really awesome more often? And you know, as human beings, we are wired for security and safety and comfort. And what happens often is that we get this tug of war between doing what we know we want to do and what's the best thing to do and what will help us give others a more awesome experience, and then protecting ourselves and playing it safe. So this desire for safety and for comfort, it's kind of wired into our psychological DNA, and it stops us often doing the very things that will help us learn more and grow more and serve more and succeed more. And I know that by the very virtue of the fact that you are here today, you are all people who are committed to being successful in your lives and to creating awesome experiences for yourself and for the people that you interact with. And I guess it just takes sometimes time to take a step back and go, you know, what is it that I'm doing that I could do better? And how could I have those moments of feeling like I'm at my best and I'm making a difference and I'm making a mark on others and moving forward, forging new ground more often? You know, there's that old saying, if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll keep getting what you've always got. And Mike was just sharing about just the pace of change these days. There's so much going on with technology. It's hard to keep up. And it's really easy to get distracted by all of the different things that we can keep pulling our attention away. And as he was talking about just sometimes simplifying, it made me think of just that saying of don't let the trivial many get in the way of the vital few. You've all heard of Pareto's principle, that it's 20% of what we do that makes 80% of the impact. The challenge is figuring out what is the 20%. So as you listen to what I have to share over the next 45 minutes or so, I want you just to think about in your own life, in your work, and in your interactions with other people, what is it that you could do to dial it up here and there so that you are having more of those experiences yourself of just really being connected to what it is you love to do, to what it is that you want to do to impact others, to how you can make your own biggest mark. So a little lesson on neuroscience, neuropsychology here. Do we have any neuroscientists in the room? No? That's good. I can pretty much make this stuff up. So you know, our brains are wired to be risk averse. And when it comes to you doing what it is you want to do better and more often and have those like big impact results, it's important to sometimes realize where we have what we call cognitive biases, like our own blind spots that get in the way of taking the actions that we need to take, that we can take. You know, most of us live in a restricted circle of what is possible for us. We don't fulfill the potential that we have. And the reasons are because we often don't even realize what's possible for us. And when we're sitting at those decision-making points, and sometimes it's big crossroads decision-making points, but sometimes it's the little things. We have these biases that have us often taking actions, making decisions, veering away from doing the things that would actually serve us and help others. So the first one of those is that we tend to overestimate the risks. We are wired to focus more on what could go wrong than on what could go right. So we tend to kind of go, will I do it or not? This was what could go wrong. People often hold back from actually putting themselves out there. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 7 years. Actually lived in the US for 11 years, and till a few years ago. And I was living just outside D.C. in a place called McLean, Virginia, and this woman put up this big wall, and it was called the Courage Wall. And it was like, what would I do if I was being brave? And all these people came out and wrote on it. I'd ask her out on a second date. I'd quit my job. I'd go back to study. I'd make more cold calls. Why is it that we so often don't do the very things that we really want to do? It's because we're afraid of what will go wrong. We are wired to be looking at, oh, this is what could go wrong and this is what I might lose versus this is what I could gain. The other thing we tend to do is we tend to underestimate our ability to handle things. And if you think about it in terms of your work, handle the rejection, handle the difficult conversation. It's not the actual event that we're afraid of, it's how we'll feel if it happens. And ladies, we tend to underestimate ourselves that much more than guys. We tend to doubt ourselves more and back ourselves less. So to you, I would say even more so, don't sell yourself short. Don't underestimate what you can handle, because it's a lot more than you often give yourself credit for. We also tend to catastrophize the outcomes. I remember years ago, my very first book came out. It was called Find Your Courage. And McGraw-Hill, a big publisher, picked it up and said, we want to, get this out around the world. And in the lead up to it coming out, I woke up in the middle of the night. And in my mind, in my imagination, my face was on the front page of the New York Times with the byline, World's Worst Author. The reality is, as Donald Trump knows, that would be, any publicity is good publicity. And that would have probably been a great way to have sold books. But we often go to these worst case scenarios when we're thinking about doing something, putting ourselves out there. We tend to catastrophize the outcomes. And so often we scare ourselves way more in our imaginations than we ever do in real life. Because if something bad happened, we'd go in, we'd intervene. We also tend to discount the cost of inaction. Now, you guys have created awesome results over the last 12 months. I mean, just listening to that data, wow, that's fantastic. But you've got to ask yourself, what else could we do? Where are we leaving opportunity on the table by not being bolder? What are the actions we're not taking that could generate more results? We are really good at putting ourselves in the shoes of us a day, a week from now, and imagining how we'll feel if things don't go to plan. What we're not so good at is putting ourselves in the shoes of us 6 months, 1 year, 5 years from now and going, what is it I might miss out on if I don't take this action? It's sometimes hard to really be able to measure or get your head around what are the opportunity costs of teetering towards caution, of saying, oh, look, I won't say that, I won't do that, I'll stick with what's familiar and what's known, because that feels safer. And we trade that long-term possibility for the short-term security and comfort, because we're wired for certainty. We want to know what's coming. And your success is proportionate to your willingness to sit with uncertainty and get uncomfortable. And finally, we're wired to want to protect the status quo. Do any of you here own a piece of clothing you spent a lot of money on, a jacket, pair of pants, shoes, that you spent a lot of money on it, but it doesn't fit you very well, but you just can't throw it out? Yeah. We are wired with what's called a sunk cost bias. If we're going down a path and we've put a lot of time or money or energy or our reputation or identity into it, we tend to want to stick with it, and we invest more in a losing proposition because we don't want to say, it's not working. It's just not working. It's why Concord, for decades, the US and British and French governments kept pouring millions into a losing proposition because they'd put so much in it. We don't like saying, this isn't working, and we often protect that status quo. We're change averse. So the question is if you were really opened your arms wide up to change, whether it's to embracing a new technology or a new way of doing things, a new process, a new system, for you personally, how you go about running your day, running your life, managing your relationships, what might open up for you? So I'm going to cover a few different ideas over the next, let's say, 40 or so minutes. And these are each of them. Begins with knowing your why. Why do you do what you do? What really matters? Now, earlier we were looking at that hotel in LA and they're saying it didn't have a lot of bells and whistles. Well, I don't know if anyone sells many houses that look like this. This is actually where my dad grew up in. And we called it the Red Shed, even though only the roof of it's red. The local government asked him to paint it green to blend in with the environment, but as a protest, he refused to paint the red, the roof green. But Dad lived in this when he was a kid for quite a few years with his mum and dad and his brother. And when the tide came in, it was just sand. They slept in the rafters. My nana, she used to cook in a camp oven on the beach right nearby. He and his brother would go out fishing. They had no toilet. They had no running water. They had no showers. There was no central heating. But you know, he looks back on his years living in this shed as some of the best years of his life. He thinks about them so fondly. And earlier Mike was talking about, are you in the property business or are you in the technology business? How you could argue that. Well, really at the core of it, you're in the people business. And it's not about what you do, as Maya Angelou says, and it's not always about what you say. It's about how you make people feel. So why does what you do matter? Because it impacts people's experience of life. How do they feel about where they live and what they do and their process and their experience of working with you? How do you make them feel? Too often we get too caught up in the looking good and making sure we've got all the bells and whistles, but ultimately it's not about that. That's actually secondary to what's the experience people have. You know, we often think, yes, we live in a home. But actually, as human beings, the quality of our lives is shaped by the emotions we feel. I'm sure all of you have met people who live in very nice homes who are pretty miserable. And so just be careful you don't get pulled into the whole idea of, it's all about the looking good. Well, actually, it's about the feeling good, because it's the emotions we feel that shape our lives. And the more often we have any emotion, the more that impacts the quality of our life, one way or another. Someone who's always focused on what could go wrong and what's missing and what's bad, over time they end up just living in this mood of negativity. Someone who's always focused on the grateful thoughts, on what they've got and what they can do. They live with aspiration, excitement and gratitude. So think about, what is the experience that you have and how does that impact others? Because emotions are contagious. And when people interact with you, what's their experience of you? How do you show up for the people that you're dealing with on a daily basis? What can they count on you for in terms of the impact you're making on them? A few years ago, while I was actually living in DC, I went off to circus school. It was this big tent, and a girlfriend said to me, do you want to come off for a morning? I thought, it can't be that hard. I went parachuting when I was about 20 years old, and got to the big tent, and we were supposed to get up on a trapeze and do this trapeze experience. Has anyone here done that? Do we have any circus or lay performers? And so I got over there, and there was an opportunity to, so I'm just kind of looking at my slides here. There was an opportunity to do a practice on the ground level. And I didn't bother. I thought, what's the point of doing that? So I decided, I'll just wait till I get up on the platform. And I climbed up the rope ladder and I got onto the platform. It was my turn to reach out. We had to grab this bar. And I had a harness on. I had this big beefy guy behind me kind of holding me. And he's like, you're right, now reach out. So I was to reach out and grab a bar and then swing through the air. And then we're supposed to wrap our knees around the bar. And a professional from the other side would come out and grab us and we'd swing through the air. It was going to be this beautiful Cirque du Soleil moment. And people get photos and you'd post it on Facebook and we'd all feel really good about ourselves. And it didn't work out that way. And I got up to the platform and I looked down and it was about 8 feet or about 8 meters or about 24 feet for Americans here in the room who don't understand metric. And I went to reach out and I just froze in terror. Just suddenly, I honestly felt like I was going to fall to my death. And of course, I knew intellectually that I couldn't. I knew it was impossible with a harness and a safety net that I could fall to my death. And yet in that moment of choice, I was frozen. And then my friends started yelling out to me the titles of my books. Find your courage, stop playing safe. And it was a little bit humiliating. So out of professional pride and wanting to avoid being humiliated, I reached out and I grabbed the bar and I screamed and I did several oscillations, realized I forgot to put my knees over, and then I plonked down onto the safety net. I did it twice, and then because I'm a generous spirit, I gave the rest of my turns away to my friends. I share that with you because often you know what it is you need to do. You know it, and yet you don't do it. What is it that gets in the way between the knowing and the doing? And often when you dig underneath that, there is a fear of something that you may lose, something that might go wrong, and that desire for protection and security keeps us taking the very actions that would allow us to learn and to grow and to make a bigger impact on others and to have more of what it is we want. And we live with this risk-averse mindset. The mindset, and it's a little bit like the fixed and growth mindsets for those of you who are familiar with that. But the risk-averse mindset says, this is what I know I'm good at. This is what I know I can't fail at. This is where I know I'm emotionally safe. I'm not going to risk rejection. I'm not going to look stupid. My reputation will not be tarnished. And everything else is dangerous. Don't go there. It's driven by desire for certainty and for control. And for those of you who are control freaks, you know, often that desire to want to control every factor keeps us from just stepping into the uncertainty and going, you know, I'll figure it out when I go along. It's great to have a plan, but as everyone knows who's ever been in a situation where you've had to execute on a plan, our plans never survive their first collision with reality because life, we cannot predict what's coming. And so it's so important to embrace what I call a risk-ready mindset that says, you know what? I can plan, I can prepare, we can do our numbers, we can analyze, we can put our plan in place, and then I just got to put myself out there. I've got to put myself out there where it's uncomfortable, where I don't know 100% that I'm going to nail this, where I don't know that I'm going to succeed, where I could mess up. You don't wait till you know that your decision is 100% right. You just go with what you feel is probably right. Too often people put off making a decision because they're afraid of making a wrong decision. Yet at what cost? What's the opportunity cost when you don't just execute? So for you right now, as you think about the things that you're working on and the actions you could be taking, where are you holding back going, oh, I just want to wait until I know for sure? And what might open up for you if you actually just said, I'm just going to get out there and give it a go. I'm going to try. We often move toward where it gives us a sense of short-term security, and we kind of think, well, if I play it safe, I'll feel more secure. But the truth is, particularly given today's changing world and the market, and your competitors are sitting back going, how the heck can we gain ground on you? They're trying to figure out what is it that they can do to take your share of the market. Put yourself in their shoes. Ask yourself, if I was my biggest competitor, what would I be doing to be making ground on you? Take on that, like that offensive mindset. What is it that others might be doing that if I play it safe, I'm going to miss out on opportunities? Because when we play it safe, yeah, it can give us that short-term sense of security, and sometimes we can get a little bit complacent when we're out ahead of the pack. But where are others? They're working furiously to gain ground on you. And so do not underestimate the cost of playing it safe. And more so, dare to play a bigger game. You know, you as a whole organization, yes, you're a big company, but it's made up of individuals. And imagine what would be possible if every one of you committed to playing the biggest game, to saying, you know what, what's the biggest game I can play? What's the biggest mark that I can make? How can I support those around me in doing that? The sky is the limit, and as I'm sure you've heard the saying, the biggest limits we have are those in our own heads, the ones that we're buying into. So where are you playing it too safe personally? What are you leaving on the table? Where do you need to set bigger, bolder goals for yourself? A few years ago, my family, I have 4 kids. Yes, all mine. Someone asked me recently, are they all yours? Yes, they're all mine, no twins. Same husband. And it was his coming up to his 50th birthday my husband Andrew, and I said, well, what would you like to do? He said, I'd like to go on a safari in Africa with my family. And I thought, that sounds like a nice thing. And one of my kids, Ben, said, oh, yeah, Mum, but you can see those animals at the zoo. Yeah, I know, don't even start. And he said, but wouldn't it be cool if we climbed Mount Kilimanjaro? And we kind of sat back and go, like, that's a pretty big mountain, Ben, I think. We're not exactly a mountain climbing family. We lived by the sea at the time in Melbourne along the beach in Bayside, and, not exactly a lot of hills. But he did this PowerPoint video and he did this whole Rocky music theme. But imagine if for Dad's birthday we climbed to the rooftop of Africa, and he was all revved up, and at the end I'm like, yes, let's do it. And then we actually realised, this was actually a pretty mountainous undertaking. But we set off and we went over to Tanzania, and we did a 7-day hike, and it took us 4 days to get to base camp, which is about a long way up. It's about 18,000 feet. And so on summit day, we set off at 2 o'clock in the morning. And we started hiking, and my youngest was 13 at the time, and after about half an hour, he was crying because his fingers were so cold. And then after another half an hour, Ben, the one whose idea thought it was so great, he was throwing up his breakfast. He said, Mum, you shouldn't have told me to have 4 bowls of porridge. I was like, I thought it would be good to fill your stomach up. Yeah, bad advice. And then I was feeling incredibly sick, and I ended up vomiting as well because the altitude, it's just, it takes its toll. And we walked so slowly, I can't even describe how slowly we were walking. It was about this pace, and I was still, my heart beat through my chest, and every, literally 2 or 3 minutes, we'd just have to stop to catch our breath. But eventually we got to the top, and we're all lying there fairly exhausted. And we'd cursed Ben all day. Why did you come up with this idea? But we got there. And we're lying there, and I realised that we wouldn't have got there had we not all been pulling each other up, pulling in the same direction toward the big vision. Mike talked about you want people to have the finest experience. When everyone's pulling in the same direction, whole things that weren't possible become possible. Likewise, you have no idea what you're capable of doing until you dare to try. Michelangelo once said, the greater danger isn't that our goals are too big and we fail to achieve them. It's that they're too small and we do. And too often we set our sights here because that's doable, when actually we're capable of this, going up there, and you mightn't get there, but gee, you're going to get a lot further. We mightn't have all made it to the top of the mountain. And a lot of people said, just be prepared, you mightn't all make it. They were taking our oxygen the prior 4 days just to check, because people die climbing at that altitude, and a lot of people don't make it. And yet we did make it. And I think we were probably a bit bolder and more ambitious than we had the right to be, but we made it. And what it taught me was that, how often do we sell ourselves out of incredible experiences because we think we can't do things, when in fact we can? And where are you setting your sights on what's doable and what's probable, what you can probably achieve, versus what's possible? And what would open up for you? So often we just kind of go with what is comfortable. But you have capacity to dig deep and do things beyond anything you've done before. And yet that fear of failing and falling short gets in the way of even daring to try. A few years ago, I was invited to go to Necker Island with Richard Branson. And I write for Forbes, and I was invited to interview him on the first night. And I was asking him about his experiences, as there was a group of leaders and entrepreneurs there gathered on his island. He brings these groups together. And, he was sharing early on how he was, getting a second and a third mortgage on his house. And I said, how was your wife with that? And he goes, I didn't tell her. And as any of you know, if you know his story, not everything he's touched turns to gold. It's easy to look at somebody who's got to the other side of their largely their working life and is really successful and go, yeah, it was all just destined that they'd be successful. Well, that's not the case. People who are really successful, and I've met and interviewed and worked with quite a few, they are constantly taking on things and trying things, and they don't know if they'll succeed. Successful people aren't those who haven't failed. they just don't spend years and years dragging out their failures. They go, okay, let's try this. And then if it's not working, they tweak it, they pivot, or they say, let's just quit it and move on to something else. They learn to fail fast and fall forward. And for you, if you gave yourself permission to try more things, to take more risks, what would open up for you? You know, people who succeed faster are those who are just willing to double their failure rate. That doesn't mean you're going to fail every time. It's not that you want failure, but you've got to risk it and risk it and risk it more and more often. And be smart about it, not just kind of going in blindly, but going, okay, what is there to learn? I tried something, I didn't get the results I wanted. What can I learn from this? Marty Seligman, the founder of positive psychology, said, you can tell how successful someone will be by how they explain their failures. If you explain it as a permanent inadequacy on your part, I'll never be good at this. I haven't got what it takes. It was always going to be impossible. Then you're not going to take any learning that's of value and move ahead. But if you look for what is it I could have done differently, what do I need to learn more? Maybe I needed to engage more stakeholders. Maybe I needed to prepare in advance and have more practice. Whatever it is, that allows you to do as Henry Ford said, to move ahead more intelligently. And with that, challenging what you see as possible. So I grew up on a small dairy farm in rural Victoria. Do we have any Victorians here? Oh yeah, quite a few. Great. Anyone from East Gippsland? No, I can't see anyone. So I grew up in an area of Victoria about 4 hours from Melbourne on a small dairy farm. My dad left school at 16, milked cows for 50 years. My mother was actually a nun for 9 years prior to meeting my dad. Everyone's looking for the scandal. And she left the convent, met my dad, got married, 7 kids, Francis Patrick, and then me, Margaret Mary. There we are. And I found this photo a few years ago because when I was about 13, I said to my dad, you know, I'd really like to be like Jana Vent, who was a journalist on 60 Minutes in the 1980s. And I was like, oh, I'd love to be like Jana Vent, a TV journalist. And my mum said, oh, darling, you don't read the paper enough. You don't know what's going on in politics. And you have to love reading. And, you know, we didn't have a lot of books. My parents weren't necessarily very big readers. We didn't talk politics. And we didn't get the paper. We got the Weekly Times and the Catholic Advocate. So I didn't have much chance of being, you know, out there primed on what was happening in the world of politics. And I found this photo a few years ago, and I have these nappies, diapers to Americans, cloth ones on our heads. I realised my parents' dad was sort of grooming me for an early age to take up a vocation. And he said one day, I remember, Margaret Mary, I see great things for you. I was like, do you, Dad? I was thinking of Meryl Streep, Princess Diana, Margaret Thatcher. He said, I see you being Sister Margaret Mary, in charge of a convent. Wasn't where I was sort of seeing myself going. That wasn't particularly inspiring to me. But so often, when we're starting out in life, we buy into stories and labels and the beliefs, the limiting beliefs of the people around us. Sometimes our parents, their vision wasn't big because they hadn't experienced the world of what was possible. And mine was extended about as far as our backyard. And so what you see as possible for you is often very limited by the stories that you live in. And our stories are made up of beliefs and assumptions and labels. Well, I'm hopeless at this, and I'm no good at that. And I could never do that, and I didn't get that education, and we come up with all sorts of stories. And we treat those stories as though they're the truth, when in fact they're just stories that we tell ourselves. When I was 21, I finished university and I went off around the world for a year, and I was in northern Thailand. And I went on a hike, and we were staying in a little village overnight, and this guide said, I was kind of talking to us about the life of the village, and I said, how come these big elephants, these, 14-foot elephants don't wander off from the village? And he said, when they're born, they put an anklet around their leg and tether them with a rope to a stake or to a little tree inside the village confines. And the elephants are about 10 feet at birth and weigh a ton. They go to wander off, and then they can't go any further. And they try dozens of times, but over time they just give up trying. And then between the age of 2 and 3, they remove the rope. And of course, the elephants now are full grown and they have the ability to wander off. But they don't even bother to try because they think they can't. They've bought in to the belief that it's not possible for them to leave the village unless they're being led by someone in the village. And so they don't try. And so often we as human beings live in these stories and they confine us. They keep us from actually taking the actions we are absolutely able to take. And when you think about what it is you want to do and what real success looks like for you and for you as an organization and for your team, where are you stuck in some stories about what can and can't be done? Where are you buying into assumptions? You know, that idea that what got you here won't get you there. You know, that mental map. You have a mental map of how to get from point A to point B, and maybe once upon a time it was accurate, but the map's changing, the world's changing, and you've got to be changing with it. You've got to be stepping back and questioning those assumptions that you tell yourself and challenging the labels that you put on yourself or others about what you can and what you can't do. Because the stories, the things we're telling ourselves in our head, they trigger and amplify emotions, how we feel. Yeah, we can do this. Let's give it a go. Yeah, let's take on that mountain, whatever that mountain is for you. Or, oh, there's no way you can do that. Nah, someone tried 5 years ago. It was a total disaster. Don't try again. And so the emotions, our emotions are what are predispositions for action. And those of you who know your sales, it's how people are feeling. It's not what they're thinking that determines what they do. And likewise for you, what are the emotions that your stories are amplifying that are keeping you from taking better, braver, and smarter actions? And recognizing that in others too, because the actions you take create the outcomes. In any area where you're not getting the results that you want, you keep butting your head against the same wall, or maybe it's the same person. Anyone here ever deal with challenging people? Put your hand up. Are they next to you? You know, it's funny, there's too many, ha, 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 ha. Yeah, they are. You know, if you work in a team of more than just yourself, then you're dealing with challenging people because we all have our own stories. And sometimes we have a victim story. Oh, it's not, they all did it to me. Sometimes we have a villain story. We blame, it's because of them that things aren't great. So just recognizing we've all got our stories and the people you're dealing with have got their stories. And the people that you want to move in to take a different action, your ability to influence people, to move them to taking different actions is proportional to your ability to understand what's the story they're living in. What are they telling themselves? What emotions does that generate? Where is that keeping them from taking an action? And the more you can understand their story and put yourself in it, not just see as they see, but feel as they feel, the more effective you'll be in getting them to see things the way you see them and to changing their perspective. So on that comes building trust. You know, trust is the number one currency of influence. And often when we think about trust, we think about being trustworthy and honest, good person. But trust often means more than that. In fact, it means a lot more than that. When I met Richard Branson a few years ago, the first day he'd just flown back in from the Congo the night before, and I was sitting in what they call this roundhouse where they have, incredible speakers come, and we had a whole lot of incredible speakers. And I saw him and I turned around and I said, "Oh, good morning, welcome home." And I was a little bit nervous, actually, as some of you might be, some of you mightn't be. But I was a little bit nervous and I was thinking, you know, he's just a person. He's just a human being, Margie. Don't come up with a story that he's some godlike figure just because he is an international entrepreneurial icon. You know, that doesn't mean he's any different, ultimately, at the core than anyone else. And I turned around and I said, welcome home to his island home. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you've got beautiful eyes." And I was just taken aback. It was not what I was expecting. And I kind of probably blushed. And he goes, "Yeah." And he called someone over and he goes, "Hasn't she got gorgeous eyes?" And I was like, "Stop it." I was finding myself getting a little bit flustered. You know, and I'm not saying this so that you tell me I've got beautiful eyes. I'm just sharing it because you could imagine feeling a little bit that way. And then that night I had to sit down and interview him. And he said to me, I said, I'm going to interview you, ask you questions. And, he was like, oh, that's fine, whatever you want. He was in bare feet and board shorts, pretty formal. And he said, oh, I've just got to stop. I hope your eyes don't distract me. Now, he wasn't being sleazy. He was just being fun. Yeah, sure. He was just being fun. So I punched him and said, just shut up about the eyes. And in that kind of moment, it was just this building rapport, and we had a great interview. I share that with you, not because I'm trying to have you tell me I've got beautiful eyes, but because so often we let our fear of having those personal moments with people and connecting with people get in the way of just being authentic and being real. And, I wasn't sure if he would be a very up himself, arrogant, aloof, distant person. But at the end of the day, he was incredibly affable and friendly and warm. And, when we left Necker Island, we got this photo, and he took this photo like this. And he said, did your husband tell you got beautiful eyes? I'm like, no, he never tells me. And we took this photo, and he goes, you've got to tell him that he's got to tell you about beautiful eyes. So I texted it to my husband. I said, Richard Branson says you have to tell me I've got beautiful eyes. And my husband texts back, I will not be solicited by anyone. And it was a funny story, and I just enjoy sharing the story because it's kind of funny. It didn't change him. But how do you make people feel? And we can get caught up sometimes in looking good and being the whole package. You've got your smick outfit and you're looking great and you drive your nice car, and that's great. But how do you make people feel, and do you connect on a personal level with people? Because that's what makes the difference, that being real, being authentic, not trying to be this polished thing, because often we put on this mask of I've got it all togetherness, and hey, don't I look schmeck? And actually it keeps us connecting with people, and just on a human to human level. Today, people are hungry for it. And the more technology we got, the hungrier we are for the actual personal touch. And sometimes the technology we have can actually keep us from connecting at a personal level. It's easier to text, it's easier to email, you can get a lot done, but actually you can miss out on making that far more meaningful connection than picking up the phone and having that conversation. So there's 4 core areas to trust. And if you think about what does trust mean for you, more so, where is there a deficit of trust? How could you build more trust with the people that you work with the clients that you serve, with those you would like to take care of, with everyone around you? Being reliable, can people count on you to do what you say when you're supposed to do it? Do you follow through? Or do you show up late and sometimes say you'll get back to people and then just not get back to them and go, never mind? Those little things matter. And research shows it's the little touch points, it's the little deposits of trust that have the biggest impact on the trust account. You can stand up and make a grand gesture, but what's people's experience of dealing with you? Do you follow through? Yeah, I'll call you tomorrow, and I call them when I say I'm going to call. And if I can't call them, I let them know I'm sorry. Or if I know I'm going to be late, I let them know. Or if I can't deliver, I don't promise to deliver something that I can't deliver. And if you sometimes find yourself being spread so thin that you're running out of time because you've just overcommitted, what's that costing you in terms of your reputation, your trust? Don't promise what you can't deliver. Far better to obviously exceed expectations than not to meet them. Competence, do you have what it takes? Do you know yourself? Do you know your market? And I'm just going to take that as a given, but you've got to be good. Otherwise, they'll go to someone else who they think is going to know more, have more expertise, more skill. Sincerity, do you mean what you say and say what you mean? And more to the point, can people trust that you would do the right thing by them, even if it costs you? And sometimes that's a hard one. Am I actually saying what I really think? Can people count on my absolute integrity? And when it comes to building trust, you don't want to get a short-term win for a long-term loss of trust. It's a long game. Play the long game. And finally, do they think that they care about what I care about? Do they care about me as a person, or am I just a transaction? And Mike shared earlier with his previous filing system, just go through and just touch base. And, I know that he would write notes about, they had a baby's name was, and he could follow up and say, hey, how's the new child, or whatever it is. I am interested in you as a person. You're not just a potential income source for me. And, trust is the number one currency of influence, and mistrust. Professor John Whitney from Columbia University once said, mistrust doubles the cost of doing business. But also mistrust can keep you from even getting the business. And given the industry you're in, there's an already listening a lot of people have that, I don't know, you can trust them. They just want the sale. You've got to work extra hard to build trust. And it's a long game often. And so how is it that you show up? Do you show up as someone who is truly trustworthy? And what is it you can do to be more worthy of trust for others? And our radars, people's radars, there's that radar that's like, something about them, they're too smooth, I don't know that I can trust them. That you don't want them to say that about you. And finally, story. What you focus on expands. What your attention goes to, that's where your energy goes. You've probably heard that saying that, energy flows where attention goes. And if we're constantly focused on what we can't do and what we don't want and what could go wrong, it keeps us from actually doing what we can do and moving toward what we do want and making things more right. And because we have this risk aversion bias, because we are wired to focus more on what could go wrong than on what could go right, we often don't step out there. We don't get uncomfortable. We don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable to the things that could go wrong and take the very actions that you are imminently capable of taking. To learn, to try things, to connect with people, to be real. A few years ago, that same son Ben who got us to climb Kilimanjaro, he inspired the thought with the vision, right? That lured us in. That's a cool vision. He was turning 13 and I said, what do you want for your 13th birthday? And he goes, I'd like to go skydiving. I was expecting an Xbox game, and so I was a little bit taken aback. I found out actually quite a while later that my husband had planted the idea in his mind. And so I went out and I got a Groupon thing for him to go skydiving, a tandem dive. I figured I'd gone parachuting when I was 19, 20, and how could I say no? I did have a lot of friends question how much I liked my son Ben. Anyway, I thought this would be a great experience for him. He's not my youngest child. He's my kind of Bear Grylls, child versus wild. You have to rein him in. But Ben's not like that at all. I thought, what a great experience for Ben. And as a parent, I'm very, very mindful not to be overprotective because I don't think it serves our kids to go into the world and not have had experience learning to assess risk themselves. If they've been so protected, they can make really stupid decisions. So we've got to expose them to things, and we've got to give them the opportunity to build resilience and to fail and to fail and to fall over and to try things and not get the results they want. And that sets them up to succeed in a big game of life. And so I got Ben this experience, and I was driving along Beach Road in Melbourne, toward Elwood, for those of you from Melbourne, where you do this drop-off to go skydiving. And I was driving along, and all of a sudden, my imagination went to where I hadn't let it go up until then. It went to what would happen if the parachute didn't open up. And the visual, if you can imagine the visual yourself right now, it's kind of not a pretty one. And suddenly, it gripped my body. And I looked over at Ben and my throat, literally, and I went and said, so Ben, are you nervous at all? He was sitting there, I think he'd been humming away. He goes, well, I wasn't. Because I'd let my mind go to worst case scenario, straight away my body had got anxious, my voice had got cracked and went high, and straight away my emotions were contagious. I made him anxious in that second. Likewise, you've got to be really careful that you don't spread your anxiety, that your fear of what could go wrong doesn't spread like a virus into those around you, because it too often does. And I work with plenty of big organizations, and the biggest threat to their success isn't their competitors and technologies and artificial intelligence and everything else. It's actually the fear that resides within their walls, because they're focused more on what could go wrong and what they don't want to happen than on what they do want to happen and making things more right. And so I encourage you to think about, where do you need to move more to what inspires you? The word inspire comes from the Latin, to breathe life into. What would light you up? What's your vision of success for you? Any area of your work and your life where you don't have a vision of what you really would love to create, in terms of the team you're in terms of, where you want to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now, is an area where you are acting without a compass. You kind of go along. We're wired to go the path of least resistance, to stick with what's safe and familiar and comfortable, and it keeps us from doing what's bold and what will help us to learn and forge new relationships and gain new ground. So I encourage you to think about, where do I want to be 5 years from now? What does success look like for me? What would make me feel more alive? And to trust that whatever vision that is for you, you have everything it takes to create it. Because I've worked with thousands of people, and I can tell you, we rarely aspire toward goals and visions that we don't have the innate ability. That's why Mike really doesn't want to be a pop singer. Somehow it's not him, and likewise for you, whatever it is, it's because you've got it within you to do it. So don't sell yourself short. And when you find yourself focusing on what it is that you don't want to happen, shift your focus. What is it you do want to happen? What do you want to create? And what experiences do you want to give to others, so that when they deal with you, they go, that was an awesome experience. So know your why, embrace discomfort, set bold goals, challenge your stories, build trust, and most of all, stay focused on what inspires you, not on what scares you, because you are capable of far more than you think. Thank you.